You can't make this shit up. I found my husband has 4 different affairs through one of his friends. Hello, Reddit. I've been a huge fan of this platform for a while now. I've read a lot of stories and even people's craziest experiences, so I feel it is appropriate that I share my story on here. My experience is so crazy that I'm still baffled by it. I found out that my husband was cheating on me with 4 different women. Yes, 4 different women. And I never would have found out if not for one of his friends who felt that I should know. I feel so confused and disturbed. I don't even know how to confront my husband on this. I'm still pretending as if all is well. I'm hoping that by sharing my story here, I'll get some advice on what to do and also get some respite and clear my head. I know you're probably wondering how he kept the charade up without me ever knowing, and I honestly don't even have an answer to that question. Also, my husband was a very good liar, and I'm sure he never brought any of them to the house. But first, backstory. My name is Taylor, and I am a 29 female, and my husband, Justin, a 30-year-old man. We dated for 6 years and have been married for 2 years now. We live in the United States. My husband and I met in college. A friend introduced us, and we immediately hit it off. A few dates, and soon we were fully dating. Then we decided to take the next step and move in together. Of course, it wasn't easy. We had our struggles, but I honestly thought we would go the distance. Soon after dating, we decided to get married. Our wedding was absolutely beautiful, and it will always be a special day for me. Now, my husband worked from home while I worked in an office, which was very stressful but paid very well. It wasn't small, but it was no HR nightmare either. Bills were split 30-70 between us. That is, I paid 70% while he paid 30%. While chores were split 70-30, he 70, while I 30 as he was home more. We didn't have any kids, but we were planning on having some a few years down the line. Thinking back now, there were a few suspicious instances where my husband acted suspicious. But my husband was such a good liar. He easily escaped my questions, and even when I searched his device, I found nothing. About a week ago, I was about to go to work. I had a mild stomach ache, nothing serious, or so I thought. My husband was home. We talked right before I left, and he even mentioned he would stay in at home as he didn't have any plans today. I got to work, and my stomach ache only got worse. It got so bad that I got sent home to take drugs and rest. However, on getting home, I realized my husband wasn't home. I thought my husband had probably gone out to get something from the grocery store or something. I had a spare key so I could get into the house. I got in, took some meds, drank some tea, and went to bed. I woke up about 4 hours later, and my husband still wasn't back. That was when I started to get worried. I called him, but he wasn't picking up, so I called his close friend Dan. However, Dan said he hadn't heard from him either. A few hours later, my husband came back, and upon asking him where he went and why he wasn't picking up, my husband said he was at Dan's. But I immediately called him out on the lie and told him I had called Dan, and Dan said he hadn't seen him. So how could he have been at Dan's? However, my husband laughed and corrected himself and said that he meant to say Marco, that he had been at Marco's. Marco is another friend of my husband. I wanted to ask him to call Marco and put the phone on loudspeaker and ask him what they did while he was at his house. But honestly, I know Marco. He'll lie. I've never liked him. He's one of those macho alpha guys that are way too full of themselves and is a staunch supporter of the bro code. He'll definitely lie and say Justin was at his house even when he wasn't. So I decided to believe my husband and just drop the topic. However, I was still a little suspicious and decided to check my husband's phone once he went to bed. I waited till he was asleep and then went through his phone, but I found nothing. Back then, I was so glad that I had found nothing because I had been cheated on in the past, and it wasn't a pleasant experience at all. Yesterday, my husband and I, as well as our friend group, well, mostly my husband's friends, met up for dinner. It consisted of me and my husband, Dan, and his girlfriend, Marco, a female friend of ours, and 2 more of my husband's male friends. We all had dinner at the restaurant. Everyone pays for their stuff. We chatted, and then we even went to a bar afterwards. Something that stuck out, however, was a female friend telling us about how she dumped her husband of 2 months. The husband wasn't part of our friend group, and they didn't date for long, so she never introduced him to us. She said she dumped him because he had cheated on her. She then lamented jokingly that men these days weren't trustworthy. I laughed and told her my husband was trustworthy, to which my husband nodded and everybody laughed. However, I noticed that Dan scrunched up his nose when I said I trusted my husband. I didn't think too much of it, though. A few hours after my husband and I got home, however, I noticed I had a text from Dan, and he said he had something to tell me. I remembered what happened at the bar, and I asked him if it had to do with why he scrunched up his nose at the bar, and he said yes. He said he wouldn't tell me on the phone and that he would prefer we meet up somewhere, preferably tomorrow. I was a bit surprised, but agreed. Then he said not to tell my husband. I was surprised as I typically told my husband everything, but I was very curious, so I agreed. I inwardly decided afterwards that if whatever Dan told me was Dan's private business and he just needed a listening ear, I wouldn't tell my husband as I respect Dan's privacy. But if it was something about me or my husband, I would tell him. The next day I went to work as usual. Honestly, I was so curious about what Dan had to tell me. So the moment I closed from work, I rushed out to the cafe where Dan and I had planned to meet. Funny enough, Dan was already waiting for me. We ordered some coffee and snacks and then settled down. Dan seemed very nervous, and he had to take deep breaths lots of times. Of course, I waited patiently and even encouraged him to calm down as there was no rush. Dan is an anxious and nervous person, but he is the sweetest person ever. After calming down, he revealed to me that the reason he had scrunched up his nose at the bar was that he knew my husband was cheating on me with 4 different women. My first instinctual reaction was to laugh, as I honestly believed he was joking. However, when he didn't laugh along and just looked at me with a sorry and pitiful expression, that was when I knew he wasn't joking. I was stunned. Dan explained that he felt very guilty. That's why he decided to tell me. He said I was a good person and didn't deserve to be cheated on like that. He said my husband usually went to visit them when I was at work. Sometimes he lied about boys' trips to go see them. Dan shared that he and the other guys usually lied and covered for my husband. At that point, I was on the verge of tears, but I was trying my hardest not to cry to avoid causing a scene. Dan noticed and stopped talking, consoling me. I told him I was fine and asked him to please continue. Dan then told me my husband had a second phone. How? He said the second phone was what he used for communications with the girls. Dan shared a whole lot of other instances where my husband had lied to me, things I never knew. I asked if he knew where my husband kept the second phone, but he said my husband had never mentioned it. I thanked him and even insisted on paying the bill because I was so grateful he had told me everything. To think I was so happy in our marriage, I thought he was loyal. I loved him, but after hearing this now, it is as if all the love I had for him has evaporated into thin air. And all that is left is my pained heart. I asked him if he had any proof in the form of messages and voice notes. I needed them for when I would confront my husband. He happily obliged and sent me some screenshots of convos in a group chat. Dan explained that apart from our general friend group, he and the boys had a separate group chat just for them. In the screenshots, there were convos of my husband telling the boys that he was away at one of his girlfriend's houses. If I were ever to ask, they should tell me they were on a boys' trip. He said my husband would gather them and they would go somewhere and take a shit ton of photos so my husband could use them and lie that he was on a boys' trip. I was really grateful for them. Another thing I asked Dan was if the other girls never got suspicious. Dan said he didn't know much, as my husband never told them much. He had also only ever met one of the girls, and that was because the girl had become curious and started questioning my husband about his life. Dan said the girl had mentioned feeling as if Justin, my husband, was hiding her, so Justin had taken her to meet Dan. Dan also said that whenever the girls got too curious, he would just dump them. He also mentioned that Justin had once said the reason why he had married me was because I was his favorite. Dan told me a few other things after this, but these were the main ones. And after that, the convo ended, and I went home. The moment I got home, my husband immediately noticed my mood and asked me what was wrong. He also noticed I wasn't home on time today, but I deflected and told him I had a headache. I'm in bed right now, and I don't know what to do. 8 years of my life wasted with a serial cheater. I'm thinking of waiting until he sleeps so I can search for the other phone. I'll update on what I find. Thanks for listening. ***update. ***. Hi guys. You probably remember me as the girl who found out her husband had 4 different affair partners. This post blew up way more than I expected. I have gotten a lot of requests for updates and also a lot of supportive messages. Thank you to everyone who has sent a message asking about my well-being and also giving me advice on how to move forward. As for asking for an update, so I guess here's one. Crazy things have happened. First of all, I no longer live with my husband, or rather soon-to-be husband. How did I get there? Let me explain. Remember, I said I was going to wait and search for my husband's other phone, and that's what I did. I waited until my husband went to bed. He's a fast sleeper, so that was relatively easy. After he had fallen asleep, I waited an hour extra just to make sure he was fully asleep. Then I started searching for the phone. It wasn't easy, I won't lie to you. My husband had hidden them where I would never think to find. I searched his clothes, the closet, everything, and I couldn't find them. I don't know what attracted my eyes to the shoeboxes. My husband loves sneakers, and he loves to keep them in boxes. I decided to search the boxes on a whim, because I had searched almost everything in the room and I couldn't find them. At that point, I was thinking that maybe they were in some other room. Maybe he had hidden them somewhere in the living room or maybe even the toilet, but I decided to check the boxes. I searched a lot of them, but they weren't there as my husband owns a sizable amount of sneakers. However, I finally found it in one of the sneaker boxes right under the sneaker. It was switched off, of course. I plugged it in and switched it on. It was charged. Funny enough, it didn't even have a password. And on it, I found so many things. It was crazy. I found out about the girls. There were 4, and he was even chatting up a 5th one, but it was obvious he and the girl hadn't gone far. They were still getting to know each other. There were so many things. So many of them, I was stunned. I was so shocked I started to cry. I cried for a while, though I did it silently so as not to wake up my husband. I went through the phone and they were just so much. He had been cheating on me for a long time, and not just with these 4, there were a lot of other people, but I'm guessing these 4 were the most recent ones. I took a lot of the screenshots, and I'm not even joking, I mean a lot, and sent them all to my phone. Then I collected all the numbers of the 4 girls because I decided inwardly that after I was done confronting my husband, I would send them evidence. Because from the messages they are sent to my husband, it was obvious they didn't even know he was married. One hilarious thing I noticed in the text messages was with the way my husband spoke to them. It was obvious he had implied to them that he was some kind of secret agent, and that was why he had to keep his life private from them, and they believed him. It was hilarious. Another thing I noticed that I couldn't help but be surprised by was that these girls didn't really know much about my husband. I mean, who in this day and age dates someone without knowing a thing about them? But hey, I didn't want to be too judgmental. I knew my husband could be pretty charming when he wanted to be, and these girls seemed a bit naive. Honestly, I felt sorry for them falling for my husband's lies. Another I noticed while scrolling through the phone, I stumbled upon a super recent chat between my husband and one of the girls. Glancing at the date, it hit me. They'd been messaging this very afternoon while I was slogging away at work. That must be his prime phone time. In the messages, my husband casually dropped plans to meet up with the girl the next day, which happened to be tomorrow. I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony because that tomorrow was the day I would definitely confront him and expose all his lies. Anyway, I carefully put the phone back exactly where he had stashed it and headed back to bed. I decided to deal with this and confront him the next day. Before hitting the hay, I fired off a quick text to my boss, who is a night owl LOL, giving her the lowdown on the situation. We're pretty tight, so I spilled the beans and asked for tomorrow off. No surprises there. She was totally on board and granted me the day to deal with my issues. The next day, not having to hustle for work, I kicked back and chilled at home. No rushing, no prep stress, just a laid-back morning. My husband picked up on it and asked why I wasn't going to work. I just told him no, and I could see a bit of worry in his eyes. He couldn't resist asking what's up with the sudden change. I made up a story about feeling distant and wanting some quality time together, blaming my crazy work hours. He looked surprised, trying to reassure me, but feeling something was off, I dug deeper. I pointed out his subdued response and, grabbing the moment, asked him straight up if he was surprised because he couldn't go see Sandra, one of the girls but not her real name. When I dropped that bomb, you could hear a pin drop. The silence was that intense. My husband, caught off guard, tried to smooth things over with a laugh. I wasn't buying it, though. I interrupted him. He demanded to know who this Sandra was, but no way was I falling for his act. I told him straight up not to act surprised because I knew he was cheating, and not just with one but 4 other girls. His face, pure shock. The moment those words left my mouth, it felt like a ton of bricks lifted off my shoulders. I'd known for a while, and now it was out there. My calm turned into anger. I went off, yelling at him, asking how he could do this. He stood there, lost for words, trying to say sorry, but I wasn't having any of it. Tears started flowing as the weight of it all hit me like a ton of bricks. My husband had been cheating with 4 different women. I was full-on crying now. All the strength I'd been showing before seemed to crumble, and I felt completely overwhelmed. It was like the shoe I'd put up had finally dropped. He tried to console me, but I couldn't handle it. I pushed him away, telling him to stay far from me. How could he? How do you do that to someone? He attempted to defend himself, saying he loved me and it was a mistake. I shot back, saying, "You don't make that kind of mistake. How do you mess up and cheat with 4 people? Not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 people." To make matters worse, this wasn't even his first rodeo. He was just unlucky enough to get caught this time. He'd been cheating on me for a long stretch, and I was oblivious to it all. Who knows how many women he'd been with? I started freaking out, thinking about whether he might have exposed me to STDs or who knows what. I had been loyal to him, and all the while he was out there cheating. I was overwhelmed with disgust, heartbreak, and a deep sense of sadness. Being near him felt unbearable. I didn't want to see his face. So, without hesitation, I headed straight to our room while he continued pleading and attempting to spin the usual cheater excuses. The seduction, the mistake, the please forgive me. I shut it all out. Ignoring his pleas, I grabbed a small bag, threw in a few essentials, and left as he desperately clung to me. I warned him to stay away, threatening to involve the police if he didn't. I needed to get away, so I headed to my brother's place. I didn't have the strength to explain the whole ordeal, but thankfully my brother sensed the gravity of the situation and didn't press. He did his best to make me comfortable, ordered some food, but I had no appetite. I just crashed into bed, seeking solace in a long nap. When I woke up from the nap, I checked my phone and found it flooded with messages, not just from my husband, but also from his parents. I don't know what tale he spun for them, but it seemed like he painted me as the villain. They were all sending messages, blaming me, saying it was my fault, and it wasn't just his parents. Even our friend group joined in. It was disheartening, especially from friends who knew he was cheating. The only person who didn't join the blame game was Dan. He messaged, expressing his sympathy for what I was going through and promised to explain the real story to everyone. I got back to Dan, thanking him and saying he's a real friend. Assured him not to worry, I'd handle the mess. Then, feeling like turning the tables, I made a WhatsApp group. Tossed in my folks, my husband's folks, my siblings. Even added my brother who was in the living room watching TV, my husband's siblings, my husband, all our friends, and of course the 4 girls he'd been cheating with. In the group chat, I called out those blaming me without knowing the facts, tossed in nearly all the screenshots to spill the truth, didn't hold back on my husband, declared we were heading for divorce, even called my husband's parents out for blindly supporting their son. After saying my piece, I left the group chat, leaving them to face the truth they'd been ignoring. After sending that group chat message, my phone blew up with messages. Friends reached out, apologizing and claiming they didn't buy into what happened. I didn't bother replying because, honestly, they seemed like fake friends. Some of them knew my husband was cheating and never let me in on it. I decided then and there that they were getting cut out of my life. My husband's parents and siblings tried calling, but I refused to pick up. Soon after, messages rolled in, this time less aggressive. They were asking me to forgive my husband, playing the everybody makes mistakes card. Seriously? Now they want me to forgive him? That was a no-go. Meanwhile, my husband was on a roller coaster of emotions, from begging and pleading to getting angry and hurling insults. He cursed at me, claimed I was crazy and delusional, and even said he only stayed married to me out of pity. According to him, I should be grateful he picked me. I just ignored his craziness. However, knowing my husband's penchant for craziness and petty actions, I made it clear that he'd better not mess with any of my stuff at the apartment. I warned him that if he did, I wouldn't hesitate to drag him to small claims court. I informed him I'd swing by sometime during the week to gather the rest of my belongings. He didn't bother responding to my message, probably fuming with anger. In the living room, I guess my brother finally glanced at his phone, probably after binge-watching TV. He walked into the room, looking bewildered. Seeing my expression, he understood I wasn't ready to talk about it. Instead, he suggested we go out that night to distract me from everything. My brother is the absolute best, and I'm grateful to have him. We ended up at a karaoke joint, and it turned into a night of laughter and fun. It was exactly what I needed to take my mind off things. A few days later, I was all set to grab my stuff from the apartment. Even though both our names were on the lease, I had no intention of sticking around. I figured my husband wouldn't handle the rent solo and would likely end up crashing at his parents' place. Honestly, not my problem. I shot him a message the day before, giving him a heads up about my visit. Since I still had the spare keys, I told him he could either bounce to spare me the awkwardness or just steer clear while I packed up my things. Seems like he opted for the stubborn route. I brought my brother along just in case my husband tried any nonsense. He looked all aggressive and mad when he saw my brother, so I knew he would have kicked up a fuss if my brother hadn't been there. While my husband kept on begging me to stay, apologizing and promising it wouldn't happen again, I just ignored him. My brother gave him a glare like he was invisible dust. Then my husband started bringing up the lease, asking how he'd afford the apartment. I bluntly told him that was absolutely none of my business. He looked furious, but I knew he wouldn't dare pull anything with my brother around. That gave me some comfort. We wrapped up packing, and as I was leaving, I made it crystal clear to my husband that we were heading for divorce. I mentioned getting my lawyer to whip up the divorce papers, which I'd be sending his way. I suggested he get some legal advice too, and then I walked out with my brother. That was just a few days ago, and honestly, I'm doing pretty darn well. My brother's been a champ at distracting me, and there are times I forget my husband even exists. The divorce papers will be ready soon, and I can't wait to send them to my husband, or should I say ex-husband. And that's a wrap, and I truly appreciate all the support and messages I've received. Thank you, everyone. I genuinely feel great and better. As a token of gratitude, I treated Dan to dinner again for cluing me in on the antics of my serial cheater ex-husband. Thanks a bunch. To anyone out there cheating on their partner, you seriously suck. Big time. Hopefully your partner catches on one day. Better yet, do the right thing and come clean now.